Sometimes folks are very quick to almost over-control things within their organization versus spending the time up front to determine is what we're trying to do even subject to the regulations, right? And make sure to do that homework first before you go down this bunny hole.
Welcome to Simply Trade, brought to you by Global Training Center. My name is Lalo, and together with my co-host Andy, we have well over 60 years of combined trade, logistics, and supply chain experience. Along the way, we have seen and witnessed different challenges in trade compliance. We decided to put the show together and call on our friends and colleagues in the business to hang out with us and share their knowledge in all things trade. Thank you for spending some time with us. Enjoy the show.
Today, we're going to be talking about some OFAC, ITAR, EAR. I always look at it and go MOUSE. It's like all kinds of
The
alphabet soup.
CBP, the alphabet soup. Yeah.
All right. So on today's program, there's going to be a lot of acronyms used. Case in point, OFAC a lot, ITAR, EAR. And you will probably need to look at those if you're not familiar with what those are, and you're trying to learn on that, you'll have to look at it. And I always have to, it's like I use it so often that I couldn't remember exactly what it was. So obviously, ITAR, International Traffic and Arms Regulations. OFAC is what? Office of Foreign Asset?
Office of Foreign Assets Controls. Mm-hmm.
Controls, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And EAR.
And the export
and
administration regulations.
And don't call it EAR either, right?
Yeah, no. Export administration regulations, right? And it's under the BIS.
Bureau of Industry and Security.
So BIS is Bureau of Industry and Security.
And Security, right.
Okay.
Well, the good news, Andy, is that we don't even need to remember any of that because we've got an expert here that's going to actually help us with all that, and that'd be Jennifer Saak, and I've known her for a few years now, and so we'll get her on here, and we'll have her sort through all this for us. And she has her own company, Tralliance, and that's her specialty is this, export controls and anything involved in that. So that's the good news, is that we don't need to remember any of all this stuff.
We talk about where to find the resources if you need some expertise in the export realm and on licenses and OFAC and ITAR and EAR and all these different things. So I'm looking forward to this. Folks, we're going to get started here right away with this.
Yep. Let's bring her on. Thanks.
All right, Jennifer, let me ask you a question. And what I've found is to become proficient at the different regulations and areas that we're talking about here, especially OFAC, it's really as you come across an issue and you have to start researching it, because it's not a case like, okay, I'm going to become an OFAC expert, and you start reading whatever. It's more of you come across a situation, you start researching it, and you obviously are learning as you go in that, but you become more proficient as more situations come up, right. I believe, right?
And each set of regulations per country, right, is right. Written so differently.
Right.
And so you may know the Iran sanctions like the back of your hand, but switch out the country and the framework is different, the way
right.
It's written, right? I mean, the actual content of the words is shockingly different, right? Because there's different groups of people working on that internally, right, within OFAC. So it's that part can surprise, the individual who's first looking, first really combing through those regulations, right? You can't always translate even something right, to another country.
Well, and the thing is, we're getting into this. I'm really interested on how the compliance side of things can keep the executive levels informed, but more specifically, what are the things that the executives are not going to learn all this detail? That's what the logistics and compliance and those kinds of things need to be right. Getting up to speed with. But what is it that, from your perspective, that the executive levels, what are the questions they should be looking for? What should they be receiving from your perspective on, here's the type of report I should be getting, and having it translated into simple terms that they can understand?
Mm-hmm. I really think that there's almost this foundational framework you have to have in terms of that relationship and support, right, from the executive level to build that up, right, and have that established relationship and that sort of public, meaning within the company, kind of broadly acknowledged fact from the executives that this is important, right? Compliance to all these regulations, these trade regulations, is important to us as a company. And then there's when it gets remotely into the nitty gritty, that's not necessarily even something that should float up regularly to the executives, right? It's the most important thing is that flow down, and then you have to figure out that right level of management, right, that has to be engaged to actually operationalize your processes.
Right.
But I think even then the caution is make sure what you float up, make sure it's very concise and very very practical, right? What do I need to know? What has changed? What do I need to know? What do I need to change in my day-to-day, right? Or what do I need to be aware of in my day-to-day? And to, as much as possible, to remove it from any regulatory citation, any references to the actual regulations, I think just deters people from taking any action because it immediately feels overwhelming. So I think once you establish as a company, the leadership is established, this is important. And then the follow-on to the people in the day-to-day operations is, okay, here's what you need to do, right? Yes, this has changed, right? A very high level of this has changed in the regulations, or this is happening, therefore you have to do XYZ, right? And keep it focused on that XYZ.
Right.
I think that approach in general it's more of like a philosophy almost, right? Leads to better success in terms of compliance.
Okay. Well, Jennifer, let me ask you this then, is that in looking at this, I think you've hit on something very, very strongly. It's like you got to build the foundation. Obviously, anything in that foundation is going to be obviously a compliance area that's, proficient in your basic regulations. But in that, and as they build up, there should be some expertise developed in some of that, and then obviously translating, the complex. This is one of the things that I always say is, you got to be able to, this is to the compliance folks, you've got to translate the complexity and the confusion, if you will, or complexity of the regulations into terms that people can relate to. You can't go in quoting, just regulations and say, here you go. It's like, the cause and effect type of thing is like, okay, I get it. This is going to be a big risk. This is potential liabilities. This is whatever the case may be, but
right.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely boiling it down to actionable things that people can operationalize, right, and adjust their SOP, adjust their process, right, in a certain department, for example, right, and truly make it actionable, so it's directly related to their day-to-day job, right, and then.
So where let's say that a company has a strong department in there and whatnot, you're taking over the area now, and let's say there's not been a focus on the OFAC. What would you do when you come in for, what are we looking at as the type of transactions that would be governed under OFAC?
Yeah. When I always think it's important that if an organization has never had to really think about or hasn't historically thought about either the OFAC regulations or the EAR or the ITAR, right? Their focus has been elsewhere and maybe one of those three, but not all three, right? The first thing is to really understand the overall structure of those regulations, right? There's a framework there that the OFAC, of how the OFAC regulations are built out, right? That's different than how the EAR is written out and how the ITAR is written out, right? So for OFAC, a key distinction that is surprising to a lot of folks that I talk to when I'm telling them about the OFAC regulations, as a kind of initial kind of introduction to it is that it's very country specific for one, right? So the Iran sanctions are going to be different than those for Venezuela, for example, right? And truly country specific. So don't translate anything, right? Really think about it by country. And then also understand that the construct of the regulations is different when it comes to this idea of licensing and authorization. Mm-hmm. The wording and their approach is maybe slightly unfortunate in that it's almost designed to confuse the user, right? So in conceptually for the EAR and for the ITAR, licensing, right, is one of the key avenues by which you gain authorization. You gain that approval from that agency to go do what the transaction you want to do.
Right.
But for OFAC, the structure is there's general licenses and there are specific licenses. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they use the word license in both of those can get confusing for the person who's new to those regulations. So I think that's a really important structure to understand, in that the specific license is really when you are asking OFAC for approval for this specific transaction. And those are the things that you have to get their blessing on, right? And they can turn down your application and say no. The general license is the construct for how OFAC has designed a way that essentially is a pre-approval, right? To say, okay, these are all the things you can do under this one general license, right? If you meet these certain conditions and you're doing this certain type of transaction, and they'll spell all that out in the general license, then you can go do that thing, that activity, without getting our approval, because it's essentially a pre-approval by OFAC. So that really throws a lot of people off, this idea that, well, it's called a general license, but I don't need to ask anyone if I can use this, right? No, so it's really an internal assessment, right, that needs to be done by the organization to understand, okay, your exact transaction, are you meeting the terms of what the general license says? And any one set of sanctions can have, for any one country, right, you could have anywhere from a handful of general licenses through upwards of double digits, right?
Right.
And each one is very specific to a certain type of transaction. So that's a key distinction. I think it's important to understand if you're new to the OFAC world.
Hey folks, we're going to be in Dallas, Texas at ICPA conference, the fall conference, on October 16th. That's the Simply Trade podcast crew. Come by, shake our hand, let's introduce ourselves to each other, and hopefully we'll make a new friend. Come by and see us. Where you're going with that, where I have seen people, I guess, or companies maybe go awry, is that there be a general license there and an individual will look at it and go, yeah, I can do this. I've got a license for it. And so they make a decision themselves, like one individual, versus the best way to administer something like that is before you go forward, would it not be wise to have some kind of I'll call it a committee, a group, an advisory group that, okay, we've got this product and you have the appropriate expertise represented in different areas. It doesn't have to be a long bureaucratic process, but it's like, okay, right. I wanted to take this product, I have this license, and this is where I'm going. Does anybody see any issue with it? Or I want to follow through with this international transaction. Does anybody see a problem with it? And it covers them. Would that not be a wise move to make?
Yeah, 100% agree with you there. Trade compliance is so much in not a solo job, right? An individual might be the only export compliance, import compliance, whatever the title is, right?
Right.
Individual officially with that role, but you're really not ever doing it in isolation, because having that leadership support, whether it's your 1-over-1 manager or a broader set of folks, right? But having that support and alignment on these key decisions, right? When when you're deciding, yep, no, we can use this general license, for example, right? We can, we have everything we need to go forward with this commercial transaction because we have all our ducks in a row, right? There are so many potential pitfalls to things, right? And interpretations sometimes where it's not so black and white, and having multiple minds on it is always a great idea. And then furthermore, the cross-functional nature of the work is such that you want your supply chain expert involved, right? Or you might need your sales, someone from sales or from manufacturing and from, engineering, right? A variety. It really depends on the nature of the transaction. So in addition to having that leadership engagement on some of these key decisions, whether it be the leader of a compliance organization or someone even above that, right, is having representation and alignment from all these other parties and stakeholders is really key, because ultimately nobody wants to see that endeavor, right, fall through later.
Well,
It's
with
in
an
everyone's
advisor
interest.
group like that, it exposes people to the question, to the issues surrounding that particular transaction, and actually it will probably hopefully expand their view on it. So I interrupted you there. You had the second where I'm assuming you go from a general license, now you were about to go into a specific license.
Right. So then that other side of OFAC, right, is then there are cases where none of those existing published general licenses fit what you want to do as a company, right, or as an organization. You then would need to apply for a specific license, and OFAC has its own IT portal separate from everyone else's, right, and to submit that. What's interesting and different about OFAC's IT system versus under BIS for the EAR or DDTC for ITAR, right? OFAC's IT system, if you've never done an application, you would be surprised when you first go in that it's really a bunch of open fields. They give you a very wide template to just basically explain, what do you want to do? You tell us precisely what you are asking for permission for.
Right.
And then we will tell you very succinctly, yes, you have permission to do what you have described, right? If they give you approval, that's what you get, right, in return. So the onus on the exporter, right, or the onus on the company, the organization who wants to do this transaction is huge, because you need to really get it right. If you did not fully describe what it is you're doing, and OFAC says, yes, you can do it, but then later you're actually doing a few other things that you didn't actually tell OFAC, right? That can be an issue, right? And it's a worst case, because you might think you have things covered from a compliance standpoint when actually there's this gap. So
as you're going
it's not as
through,
structured.
Right. Well, and as you're going through that process, obviously it would be very wise, again, to get some experts in this as they're going through. So if I'm Andy Shiles Incorporated and I'm looking at trying to do some transactions here internationally that I believe would fall under the OFAC, and I want to protect myself, and I have a license for a dual-use aerospace item. With that, where are the experts? If I'm like, man, I have a good opportunity here. It's a business opportunity. It has just flourished. Now I need to follow through with the transaction, but I want to make sure I cross the T's and dot the I's. Where do I go to get that kind of expertise?
Well, there's a lot of options. One key thing to keep in mind is give yourself a very long runway. Yeah. I've seen OFAC license applications where years go by and there is no response from OFAC, right? Despite multiple follow-ups, despite comprehensive information, literally just the department does not respond, right? And that doesn't always happen, but it's not that uncommon for it to take many, many months, if not, over a year. So when you keep that in mind in terms of how these compliance needs interweave into your operations, the piece about where do you get some help, right, is it's really widespread, and it really depends on your organization, right? What's your bandwidth in terms of working with the other party? You know, how much of the lifting do you want to do internally versus are you looking to just hand off as much as possible?
Right.
Do you have a more conservative culture, you know, or does your company culture allow a little more risk taking, right? And those are factors that can play in. Some organizations, the compliance team is driven by the legal department, right? And oftentimes those attorneys like to work with outside counsel, right? Versus a consultant. So there's many organizational cultural things that you need to factor in. So there's no one right answer on who to go to, because there are a lot of experts out there, right? Some folks like to work with smaller organizations. Like we are a smaller organization and we tend to support small and medium-sized organizations, right? And so you have to be able to have that transparency and really good working relationship. But there are, it's plentiful at the moment, right? In terms of resources, and it's important to find the right one that you can establish a good rapport with. So whether it be looking through your, the professional societies, right? You mentioned a conference earlier, right? That you're both attending, right? It can be through those avenues. But really, I would say that the international trade compliance community as a whole, I find is very, very open, right? I think in general, the people in this space are very willing to point you to a resource, point you to a different direction if something isn't the right one for you in front of you, right? And to help you find the right people.
Right. Well, I agree with that. It's like it's a small community in one respect, but on the same token, it's very open to where, you know what, I may not be the right one, but I know somebody, you ought to call this person or that person or whatever.
Right.
So, ICPA was one, AAEI, BIS, like you said, the conferences, just a whole host, and developing those relationships. So that's, and actually a relationship in this is more than just a consultant client type relationship. It's a little bit more business intimate in that they really need to understand what you're trying to accomplish so that person can give you the appropriate guidance.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really critical to find someone that is willing to spend the time understanding your culture, your organizational culture, your business priorities, right? It's not just, we need to get this out the door as soon as possible, or, it's not an ASAP situation. They really want to understand the whole picture, because there are interpretations and risk-based decisions to make, right, as you go along through an analysis or through certain key decision points, and you want to make sure that all that's in alignment.
Okay. Jennifer, is there something in particular that you want to emphasize with to people that are listening here about OFAC or ITAR, the differences or anything along that realm?
Yeah, for sure. There's something that I think is a really key difference, and one that maybe people don't spend enough time on necessarily thinking about right up front, is this concept of when are things not subject to the EAR or when are things not subject to the ITAR, right? Both those sets of regulations have exclusions that are defined up front, right? And sometimes folks are very quick to almost over-control things within their organization,
right,
versus spending the time up front to determine is what we're trying to do even subject to the regulations, right? And make sure to do that homework first before you go down this bunny hole of needing to classify and determine licenses, etc., right?
Right.
So when you spend that time up front on those exclusions, as you go down the layers, right, and read these definitions, one key thing to keep in mind is that those exclusions on the surface can look very similar between the EAR and the ITAR, but in fact there are some really important differences. So a big one is around technology and information and published information, right? So under the EAR, it's referred to as published, is the word that's used. Under the ITAR, it's the phrase public domain. And when you go through those sections in detail, what you discover is on the ITAR side, there is an aspect of needing permission to publish, versus on the EAR side, you don't need permission from them, right? And so that's a small distinction, yet an important one, because it actually you could really trip over yourself, right? And be in a non-compliant situation kind of by accident if you're used to playing in the EAR world and now you find yourself under the ITAR.
Well, let me throw a scenario at you that I've seen of most recent. I actually just had a conversation with some folks, and it's a company that's based in the East, a U.S.-based company. They have offices in China, in Russia, in Turkey, and a couple other, several places around the world. But in particular, I was just sitting thinking, I was like, they have a transaction where they're selling to a Chinese company and thinking, okay, that's fine, but yet the end use may be that they're selling to a Russian company because of the sanctions and things of that nature, and or through Turkey or through and I'm like, whoa, man, that could be hard to control, but on the same token, it falls right in with what we're talking about here, would it not?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think what you're describing gets to this point of, one, due diligence, of understanding, okay, you're selling to company X, but what is company X doing with the thing you're selling them, right? Are they asking those questions, right? Is really, as the initial exporter, your responsibility, right, to ask those questions and make sure that there isn't an inadvertent re-export, right, that you didn't know about because you didn't ask, right? And it's very different in terms of due diligence. If you asked and then and had them sign the right end use certificates, right, and you had the right terms and conditions in your terms of sale and things like that, right, and you took those precautionary measures from a compliance standpoint, those are two very different outcomes, right? If it comes to roost later that there was a re-export, right, to Iran, a re-export to some other place that maybe it's not even a sanctioned country, maybe it's just, or to Russia, right? Maybe it's to just another country that needed a license, right? And in that scenario, and by asking those questions up front, you're really flushing through that to the best of your ability, right, as the original exporter.
And to going back earlier, what we were talking about is, instead of being that lone wolf that may be asking the questions and people are looking at the compliance going, well, you're just a naysayer, or, go do your compliance thing, we'll let you know if we need you, kind of a thing, is having that advisor board and throwing that out so that it is a group of people. It's not just a single individual or a single department, and going through and having more support, broad-based support from the company in different areas.
Right, for sure. I mean, and the more that people in your organization understand, at least at a high level, and have that awareness around like what trade compliance even means, right, and the kinds of things that can trigger a need for further analysis, that's really what you want them to understand, right? So you want that salesperson understanding trade compliance in a manner that is fitting for his or her role, right? So that they know what to watch for and they know who to contact if more analysis is needed.
Right.
And that's really, you put that together across different functions. That's how you win as a group.
In looking at it, to recap this, what we've been talking about, what do you think are the most important points that we've talked about today?
Well, I certainly this point about having having support across the organization, for one, is key, right? Not just the upper level management, but also representation from all the different functional areas that intersect with trade compliance, which is most of them, right? In reality,
definitely.
Everything from engineering to marketing to
right.
manufacturing, product development, sales, and then the second important thing I think is if you have familiarity as a company in one body of the regulations, the EAR, for example, or the ITAR, don't automatically translate things that you believe to be true, right, or your understanding. Make sure that you do the homework to understand the new structure, because there are some key differences between the EAR, the ITAR, the OFAC regulations, and then furthermore, within the OFAC regulations, even then, it's country specific. So you just really want to proceed with knowledge and awareness that yes, I understand this one thing, and now I'm going to use that to gain an understanding of this next thing, and not to just assume that the rules are identical.
And to your point there is that if it's country specific, you've got a fundamental foundation of a process where goods are coming in, you're classifying them, you're selling them, you're buying them, whatever you're doing, import, export. You've got your basic processes there. But then there needs to be some kind of a bureaucratic mechanism that, okay, now we've got a transaction that's going to be possibly to Iran or China or, one of those, it's going to a geographic location that, hey, just a flag goes up so that an extra set of eyes are looked at it and say, yeah, we need to look at this, or no, it looks like it's okay. Right.
And ideally that's happening early on and throughout the process, right? If you think of the life cycle of a commercial product and think of the earlier product development stages, right?
Right.
The most robust compliance program is going to be asking certain export compliance questions up front at that stage, right? Where there's just that initial concept of what's this product going to be and who are we trying to sell it to, right? And if you can start that conversation early, it makes everything else easier,
Jennifer,
and more efficient.
That is so important, and I say it so often. A part, for example, if you're buying, selling, or manufacturing, doesn't matter. A part does not just happen. It's designed. It takes time to get into the catalog, if you will, and online. It's going through the process of being sourced. So early on in that discussion, the compliance needs to insert themselves and become part of the assessment team to say, is this going to be worthwhile?
Right. Yep, for sure. And even then, it's not just up front and then at the end, right? There's intermediate stages upon which, there ought to be a compliance check in there. The same way there are safety checks, right, or quality checks. They really kind of they all fit together. It fits together with really the natural operations, right, of the life of a product, and you can do it efficiently in a way that doesn't cause heartache, right, for the business.
Well, and you want to be a compliance person that's not constantly, no, you can't do this, or no, you this, or whatever. You want to be somebody that's looked at as a resource, because when you need to really take a stand and go, all right, we've got a problem. If you've done that too many times, you're going to be like that guard dog with no teeth. You don't have any way to bite them. I mean, it's like, hey, wait a minute, you need to stop here and say, let's look at this and see what we need to do and have credibility with it.
Well, Jennifer, we've gotten quite a bit of great information on your end, and maybe in a minute or less, what is your best trade tip or hack that you might have, whether it's kind of related to this? I don't know if you might have something that have a nice little gem there for us.
Sure. Yeah. No. Definitely. So from an export control standpoint, right? Whether you look at, well, really, if you, my mind is more on the EAR and the ITAR. Is when you're combing through those regulations and finding that nugget of what you need, right? The definitions of words and terms really matters. And that's something that I see people trip over all the time, right? They see a word and they apply the dictionary definition or whatever definition they think applies, right? And they can end up under controlling something or over controlling it. And so if in the EAR, especially if a word is in double quotes or in single quotes, it's defined. It's either defined in that main, definition section, or it's defined in maybe that ECCN entry, but guaranteed it's defined. BIS has defined it for you somewhere. And it behooves you to actually read that definition and make sure that what you're doing meets what they are calling, whatever that word is, and make sure that you're not over interpreting it.
Sure.
So that's my best practice tip is
awesome.
look up the definition.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is great. Andy, we got some nice information here, and so Jennifer, just so you know, and actually just for our audience, we will have your contact information in the show notes. And when we do post this on the actual video, we'll have ways of people getting in touch with you so that they can, maybe ask you more questions or whatever, just hire you if they need to on such complicated matters like this.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.